Welcome to Discover You, an inspiring podcast exploring cutting-edge solutions to our everyday psychological challenges. We explore complex mental health issues and talk to professionals, experts, and renowned authorities at the forefront of transformative healing. Our mission is to educate and destigmatize, and to ultimately view mental health as a proactive quest for optimized living and equilibrium, rather than mere crisis intervention. Welcome to another episode of Discover You, our podcast exploring innovative and effective solutions to issues in mental and behavioral health. I'm JD Kalmenson, CEO of Montare Behavioral Health, a family of dynamic and comprehensive mental health treatment centers in Southern California. I am so honored and excited to introduce you to our fascinating and deeply compassionate guest today, Polly Young-Eisendrath PhD. Polly is a Jungian analyst, a psychologist, and a psychotherapist in private practice. She is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Vermont and is the founder and director of the Institute for Dialogue Therapy. She's the author or editor of 18 books on the topics of parenting, adult development, intimate and parental love, Buddhist theory, Jungian psychology, women's development, couple therapy, couple development, and various paths to awakening and enlightenment. These books have been translated into more than 20 languages. Her most recent works are the Self-Esteem Trap, Raising Confident and Compassionate Kids in an Age of Self-Importance, and Love Between Equals, Relationship as a Spiritual Path. Dr. Young-Eisendrath is a lifelong Buddhist practitioner in Zen, Tibetan, and Vipassana lineages and brings decades of leadership in mindfulness practice within the Buddhist context, as well as integrated into her clinical work. Welcome, Polly. I'm truly honored and grateful that you've taken the time to be with us today and share your wisdom. It's especially great to have you here with us during this time of extreme conflict in the world. There's so much anxiety, fear, and uncertainty floating around, ranging from social unrest, global warming, war, a pandemic, political polarization. It's so easy to be overwhelmed right now with negative emotions. And I think all of us, no matter where we are on the spectrum of mental health, can use tools, coping skills to be able to better deal with discord. And after so many thousands of years of human civilization on this planet, it's shocking about how little progress we've made in conflict resolution. I'd love to start our discussion with some of the broader philosophical issues pertaining to conflict and the human psyche. And then perhaps we can move on to talk more specifically about some of the particular distinctions you've made.
Well, hi, JD. It's great to be here. First of all, let me say that, I do my own podcast called Enemies, From War to Wisdom. And I do that podcast because I want to make clear to all of us that human beings everywhere, not just in Russia or China or whatever, we have a strong propensity to make enemies. And that comes from our natural early development, which takes place from, sort of in uterine time to about 18 months, during which time we have no language, we have no culture, really, but we have a capacity to control each other emotionally. And the way that we know this is that we have to get our needs met. And infants come well equipped with emotions, the primary emotions, and so they can make all sorts of signals about what they need and try to bring under control the adults around them because they can't survive without that, really constant attention. And then you layer on the next level of emotions, which are the self-conscious emotions that come in around 18 months that cause us to feel like we're inside of a body and the world is out there. It's the I, me, mine, the terrible twos, the no, I won't do it. That creation of an ego takes place in all humans, no matter the culture, no matter the language. And so we have a very strong desire after we create the ego to protect ourselves and to promote ourselves in groups, in any kind of relationship. So when something goes wrong, there are several things that, we should know about in understanding ourselves. First of all, we're going to look for the solution outside of ourselves from the time that we begin until the time we're sitting right here. The tendency to blame is very strong because the feeling of shame, which is that I'm bad or I did something wrong, is very painful. And so wanting to blame somebody for what goes wrong is a natural human tendency. And then, you kind of top that with the fact that most of our emotions are negative. That is, we want to constrain and protect ourselves more than just relax and open up because we're motivated, essentially, to become more and more competent in our environment. So we're motivated to see what's wrong, what's not working. We don't often notice what's right and what is working. So we have something called a negativity bias. All humans have it. On top of that, we have a confirmation bias. That is, that we tend to find evidence for what we already believe. So you put together the negativity bias, the confirmation bias, these negative emotions that motivate us often to see what's wrong, our desire to blame, and all of the issues that surround us in terms of the way we identify with a tribe or a family or a particular group. And we absolutely have the nature to destroy ourselves. And that is every one of us. And there's a scene in Terminator 2 where the little boy asks Arnold Schwarzenegger, we're not going to do very well, are we? And he goes, well, you have the nature to destroy yourselves. And the kid says, yeah, that's kind of screwed up. And it's the case. And so until we each overcome that nature, and we have to overcome it through an awareness that we are creating an enemy, this person may not be intending to do something harmful to us. But until we overcome that, we have a tendency to create again and again and again enemies in our families, in our closest relationships, among our siblings, in our communities, our societies, across our nations, and then in our species. So about 95% of the time that Homo sapiens have been on Earth, they've been at war, and often in continuous war. So,
also, what I'm hearing from you is that it's, however unfortunate war and conflict is, it does seem to be the natural tendency. I'm almost thinking about like a car that is needs an alignment because it's veering off the highway, and unless we consciously intervene, it's going to veer off. That it's just what you're describing, how this is so embedded in the very fabric of the human DNA. It reminds me of what they always used to talk about and joke around, that there's this fellow living on an island by himself, and somebody finally visits him after 20 years, and they see 3 houses of worship, and they ask him, what's going on here? And he says, well, that's the one I go to. That's the one I don't go to. And that's the one I went to.
Yes, exactly. Right. So if we understand this, then we have, let's say, a leg up on it. I mean, until you get that you and I and all of our friends and our family members, we're all highly motivated to make enemies. That is, to find someone else who intentionally harms us, that we hold at fault for at least some of our misery and suffering, and maybe a lot of it. And that is an attribution that gets sustained in our relationships with others, and it gets sustained through something called projection and projective identification, by just assuming that we know others' motivations.
So it's so interesting because there's something really foundational that at all of our levels of care and throughout the various different lines of service that we provide at Montare in our treatment, one of the common underlying themes is existential affirmation and validation. And what I'm hearing, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that if somebody really does have a very health of intrinsic existential affirmation, because they'll be more open to acknowledging that some of the challenges or some of the frustrations might be able to be resolved from within.
Well, I I think I would love to say yes. The part of the problem is that even with really good self-esteem, secure attachment bonds, affirmation of our abilities, we still have this negativity bias and this confirmation bias. Until we wake up to it and recognize it, we will still find that it's difficult to go through conflict with someone that we fundamentally disagree with, or someone who's insulting us or seems to insult us or who seems to humiliate us. Because again, of this limbic system reactivity that connects right up to the prefrontal cortex and kind of makes you the problem, even if I feel pretty good about myself. So, it would be great if a secure attachment bond was really a panacea for a lot of difficulties.
And that actually, I think, answers one of the questions that was really intriguing me about the work that you do, whether conflict resolution is a unique area in and of itself that has to be pursued and has to be cultivated, or is it a symptom of unhealthy self-esteem or deficient inner equilibrium that spills over into the conflict? But what I'm hearing is that even for somebody who has a healthy self-esteem and has serenity and tranquility and has an overall very healthy mental health sort of experience, that still will not necessarily preclude them from having unhealthy conflict resolution skills. Conflict resolution becomes this whole other domain and arena that has to have separate awareness about how to navigate. And that's what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
Well, first, even with the healthiest self-esteem, skills are needed to resolve conflict. And I want to take a moment just to say that the method that I use, which is called real dialogue, is not conflict resolution, and it's not compromise, and it's not non-violent communication. I like to make these distinctions because there are lots of methods out there, communication methods that specialize in dealing with conflict. And real dialogue is an approach to conflict which does not require compromise. It does not require any solution. And so if we avoid the idea that we need a resolution, we need a compromise, or we need to sort of tune ourselves down, we can create rules for proceeding in a humanizing, respectful way so that no party is dehumanized. Each party feels heard and seen and understood, but not necessarily agreed with or compromised with. But when we get to the point of being heard and seen and felt, and we have that sense that we're mirrored, we can work almost anything out.
If only we could have a little bit more of that in our political discourse, because that sounds so refreshing. I mean, there's a few things that come to mind when it comes to, let's say, religious differences or theological and philosophical differences. I feel like this is such an effective method or such an important mentality and mindset because, first of all, it presupposes a certain degree of humility. I don't have to impose my view on others for my view to be true. So there is a certain serenity there. You don't feel like it's all or nothing. I think that would be more, more directed at the behavioral sort of conflict, where there could only be one way to do a certain thing for it to get done, and we have opposite opinions. So if we can't come together, even if we don't finish the project together, we're still walking away as human beings. And what it also does is we don't engage in the scapegoating.
That's right.
I love that. And we're talking about this, the scapegoating and the unhealthy self-esteem. It just reminds me of a story about two brothers who were playing, and the older brother pushed his little brother into a ditch. And he said, "Wow, look at me. I'm taller and stronger than you." And it was their father happened to be walking by, and he tells the older son, "Never put someone else down to make yourself feel better. You're still in the same spot that you were before. If you want to feel better, raise yourself up.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it really helps with that. And like you said, naturally, our habit is to put others down. That's the easier way.
Right.
So I guess what I'm
Well,
asking is, does it actually also, once people sort of get into this mindset of not scapegoating and being a lot more self-aware, does that actually help resolve some of the conflicts in your experience?
well, it depends on what you mean by resolve. I've witnessed and taught how to facilitate a difficult conversation on many topics, from, for example, pro and anti-vaccination, or let's say the world of current vaccination labeling. I've done it with pro-life and pro-choice. I've done it with various kinds of preferences for how to match therapists and clients, for all sorts of family issues and a lot of business issues. And what I have seen is that when people learn to use the skills, which are I'll elaborate, they're a little bit more than what the titles sound: speaking for yourself, listening mindfully, remaining curious. Those are the three skills that the people have to use in this kind of facilitated conversation. When those skills are used, what I've seen across the board in organizations, with audiences, with the people themselves, is crying, just this relief that I can talk to somebody who disagrees with me or who's on the other side of the issue, that I can talk to that person as a human and they can understand why I have the feeling I have, and also the experience I have of the data or the evidence or the point of view or the belief. They can understand that because they're human, and I can understand them because I can begin to see that these beliefs, these opinions, or these points of view are rooted in subjective experience of that other person. The other person's experience makes sense. They're not coming at this to harm me. They're not coming at this to, undermine me.
Mm-hmm.
They're coming at this for their own reasons. And so what you find is that people gradually move away from the idea that there's an objective world out there that we can agree on if we just get the facts, and much more towards the idea we're enclosed, each of us, in a kind of snow globe of our own subjectivity. And that has to do with our language and culture, also, our emotional reactivity, and also our habits, our emotional habits from our early family life, relational life. There are lots and lots of things that go into our subjectivity. And what happens is that we're not seeing the same world. We're constructing different worlds. It looks different. It smells different. We hear it differently, and so on. And until we explore those differences, we often take them to be intentionally against us in some way or threatening to us. And, that takes place between countries, but also between two people in a couple relationship, where very often there's the sense that the partner intentionally harms one, does this thing over and over again, even though she knows I don't like it. And of course, that's not what's going on. That's the way it looks to the observer. So pulling this apart creates tremendous relief, but not always resolution. But if you walk away from a project that I'm working on, and we both are happy to see each other in the hallway on the next day, then nobody has to be a narcissist or, borderline. I mean, people call each other names like this in work settings, where they put down the other person because they feel that other person has some sort of personality disorder. This sort of thing is not uncommon. And of course, in families, it's also very common. So this is what we're trying to get rid of, is this kind of labeling as, the other person as either an idiot or just plain wrong or disgusting, toxic, narcissistic.
Right.
That's the main complaint these days.
Right.
Yeah.
That's more sophisticated label.
Yes.
Some clinical implications. It's so funny when we talk about these degrees of subjectivity. So it's so important to use that word because, first and foremost, it encourages and invites people to think from a broader perspective and not to get caught up and believe their own press. I mean, I'm reminded of the story of the fellow who's walking in the rain, and he sees a house out there and he has no umbrella and it's pouring. It's a famous story. And he's thinking to himself, maybe I'll knock on the door and I'll ask them for an umbrella. And then he thinks to himself, well, they'll look at me and they'll say, why would we give you an umbrella? You're a stranger. And then he'll respond that, I would never normally ask you. And this is all in his head. It's just, I'm so vulnerable and it's so wet and it's pouring that I'm going out of my comfort zone and I'm asking, but they'll look at me again and they'll tell me, but you're still a stranger and we don't know if you'll return it and why should we? And as he's walking, he's getting closer and closer to the house. By the time he gets to the house, he's incensed with all of the internal dialogue, and he knocks on the door, and the fellow opens the door and he slaps him in the face and he says, I don't need your damn umbrella anyway. and I just feel like there's so much of that going on. And if we take a moment, and I'm sure this is a prerequisite to the work that you do with the real dialogue, and I'd love to hear more about that in a comprehensive way in a moment, but just the ability to pause. Mm-hmm. I saw a great quote from Thomas Friedman from the New York Times. He wrote that, when you press pause on a machine, it stops. When you press pause on the human being, it starts, or we start. And I just think that pause to allow myself to be able to take stock and say, the world might not exactly be the way I'm perceiving it, with all of its nuanced details that are my subjective interpretation. Yeah. And so I that's so important. What would you say are practical skills to implement that pause, or the basic tenets of the real dialogue on the daily, as opposed to not just the conceptual ones, but on the daily exercise? For those who are listening out there, we can all benefit from this.
So the first step, of course, is to take a pause and take a breath. And then notice what's going on, that you are feeling this difficult conversation thing. And of course, if you're with somebody who knows how to use real dialogue, you can signal, let's try some dialogue. But if the other person's never heard of that and you don't even think they'd want to, then you have to use the skills yourself, which will change the tenor of the conversation. So, I'll just sketch out the 3 skills. The first one is called speaking for yourself. And of course, we've all heard of sticking with I statements and no you statements, no sneaking in you statements like I have the impression that you are manipulative is a you statement, even though it starts out with I have the impression.
How would you say that without the you?
You would say something like, I'm finding it very frustrating at this moment. Mm-hmm. To understand what you're saying, or I'm very discouraged about what's going on right now because of this or that.
That's beautiful, because what you're doing there is you're taking all accusatory language out of the sentence, out of the dialogue, and you're sharing with the other person how you're experiencing this experience, how you're feeling, and there's no real denying how you're feeling. That this is how I'm feeling.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That's the very first step that lowers the threat level. You can't argue with it.
Right.
So you're taking out the so-called objective thing of something like, narcissism or you're manipulative, which could never be determined in any case because it's the observer who's having this experience, which may be, uniformly wrong. Right. But so the very first thing in speaking for yourself is that you stop the you statements or the accusations by making something subjective. But then there's much more to it, because to retain that modesty of subjectivity, you have to stop saying that you know the truth. Like, it was the 4th of July when your mother called. The other person goes, I think it was the 5th. Now, obviously, those things are insignificant in the larger conversation. So say, I remember that it was the 4th of July. That's the way I remember it. How about you? So you get around the issues of memory, of fact, like, it's a fact that this is happening with the climate. No, instead, from what I understand, from what I read and study, this is the way it looks to me, that there's this and this and this. And again, how about you? How does it look from your side? So the facts, stating things as though you know absolutely, stating things as though you remember things absolutely. Humans are about 95% unconscious. We're terrible eyewitnesses. We don't remember things well. And when we realize that, we can take that kind of lightly. It's sort of funny, but you certainly don't assume that you're an expert at something you remember that happened 2 weeks ago or even yesterday, and much less 30 years ago. When you remember that conversation that you had with your sister, so all of this is part of speaking for yourself. So it's your desires, it's your memory, it's your impression, it's your feeling states and your desire. Like I said, desires. You can speak strongly like, I don't like that, or I'd love to do that. I hate Detroit. No problem. No problem. Right. It's fine, and so that first skill has a whole number of things going to lower the threat level, even in the way you speak. And then the second skill is the harder one across the board in all forms of conflict, remediation, whether it's conflict resolution, nonviolent communication, negotiation. It's the listening part. So that is the reason why most negotiations fail, because people do not listen accurately to each other. And the main reason is, and again, there's a lot to be said about all these things, is that we speak to ourselves instead of listening. So we're listening to what we're saying in our own ears about the other person or the situation, or we're rehearsing something that we want to say at the next step when there's a space. Wow. So the listening function has to be cultivated. And the way that we teach it as you first have to be able to hear in to your inner voices. And so there's a meditation skill that has to do with hearing in and hearing out, hearing in and hearing out, because that's always going on. We're hearing out, then we're hearing in, so that you let that narrative drop to the background when you're in a difficult conversation and you have to listen. Because the way real dialogue works is after the speaker speaks, and it's the listener says, so I'm understanding, instead of I hear you saying blah, 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 I'm understanding that this is the way that it is for you, blah, blah, and this and this. Did I get it? Did I get it? And if the other person says yes, then you can say, is there more? Or you can make the response to it. But you have to get the reflection back from the speaker that you get it the way the speaker is intending. And that allows you to step into that snow globe. Again, you're not agreeing, you're not endorsing it, you're just listening, just to the point that you're understanding what the other person intended before you respond to it.
That sounds so simple, but it is so profound and so real. I'm not sure if you discussed this because you're so prolific and you have a lot of teachings, but what about conflict within the human being itself?
Well, yes, I do. I mean, my podcast Enemies starts with that. You're very insightful in the way you're understanding this, because it is the case that within ourselves, we're also often at war with ourselves, particularly in North America, because we hold certain kinds of standards that we're always going to fall short on. Right. And so we're often really criticizing ourselves. I have a TED talk that's called The Key to Happiness is, I can't even remember what the rest of it is. The key to happiness is letting go of self-importance. I wasn't sure if it's key to happiness is letting go of self-importance. But in the talk, the self-importance I talk about is negative self-importance. How we are talking to ourselves, you didn't get that right. Oh, you were stupid. You took too long there. You did this, you did that. So that way of talking to ourselves also creates often a harmful sense of self-consciousness.
Right.
And so then we're very self-conscious about what others are saying. So that inner conflict plays a big role. Also, there's one other more subtle inner conflict. As we develop, an understanding of our subjectivity, we find that we have mental images and we have mental talk, and we also have outside images and outside talk, and we have emotional feelings and we have physical feelings. All of those things get mixed up.
Right.
So we may be seeing a mental image of someone who looks angry, and then we say that person looks angry, but the person is just having a stomachache.
Right.
I mean, there's so many ways that our mental image covers what's actually going on with other people.
Right.
And so that creates conflict within us also. Like, am I just imagining this? Is this my gut feeling? Is it, should I react to this person who has this, sort of disgusted look? It goes on and on about,
Sure.
the subtle kinds of conflicts.
I love what you're saying about tying in this inner conflict to a lack of happiness, because it's been a theory of mine for a while that happiness really is something that we're born with, and it's something that exists within us. But as we go through life and we judge ourselves and we allow others to judge us and we feel shame or a certain pain, we compartmentalize, which creates a subsequent sense of fragmentation. And now we're not really unified internally. And that's a key factor in tranquility, serenity, and happiness, being able to feel radically comfortable with ourselves. So this inner conflict is essentially a form of us placing some judgment on ourselves. And then we seek to suppress or put away or hide that part of ourselves, which is never going to allow all of us to really just be comfortable and feel represented. And the beauty of what you're describing, going back to one of the skills that you referenced earlier, is that there doesn't have to be resolution for all of us to feel comfortable. So if we take that into the sort of inner conflict within the human being, him or herself, we can have conflicting tendencies. We can have opposing feelings and sentiments and desires and inclinations. And we don't have to reconcile that necessarily and say one is wrong, one is right, one has to be converted, one has to be suppressed, one has to be eliminated. We can live with each other and still have that inner serenity and tranquility, and recognize that it's okay to have that feeling. It's okay to have that tendency, to have that attraction. And I think that today, there's so much negative talk in the news today in 2022. We're more equipped to really own that than ever before in human history.
I hope so. I mean, I think that this sort of calling out culture, the culture of let me attack you before I know you.
Yes.
That sort of thing, you're already wrong before you've begun, and so on. Right. Any kind of calling out or lowering of somebody's social status for human beings, it naturally brings about rage.
Right.
And that if there's a cycle of rage and humiliation in any kind of movement, whether it's a political interaction or it's on the schoolyard, with two kids, rage and humiliation lead to destructiveness between human beings, and so to lower the humiliation factor will itself increase our possibilities of tranquility. I mean, we have a possibility of living at peace with each other, not because that's built into us, but because we can become aware. We can become aware of what we do. We can change our behavior mid-action. No other animal can do that.
And that leads me to the next question, which is it possible, in your opinion, to engage in conflict resolution or in real dialogue if you absolutely have no respect for the person sitting across the table? Is respect a prerequisite to real dialogue?
Well, I've entered into difficult conversations in environments where it looks as though people don't respect each other, where it's typically not. I don't go into fist fights and things like that, right, but it's more a sense of contempt. and the feeling that the other person is toxic, or the other group. It's usually it's not usually just an individual, but the other point of view is toxic, is disgusting, shouldn't be at the table, whatever. I've been in situations where I wasn't sure I could handle the level of animosity that I was hearing. But as soon as I and my facilitator, we interview each person, we begin to understand what is subjectively driving this person. As soon as you see what's happening, you begin to humanize that person. And then that person has a facilitator to help with the humanization back and forth. And I just want to give you a little bit of an example, if I can. This is not exactly about the humanizing of using the method of real dialogue, but this gives you the feeling for what the method does. I've in these recent, say 5 months or so, I've gotten very involved in interviewing on my podcast people that are involved in near-death experience, the research of near-death experience, as well as the archiving of many, many cases. Now there are thousands of cases because of resuscitation medicine, and in that detailing of the near-death experience, there's something called the life review. So about 10% of people that experience cardiac arrest do have these memories of death experiences. And then of those, about 10% of those have some detailed life review. So, it's not across the board on all of the near-death experiences that you get this detail. But here's the kind of thing that comes out. I'm going to tell you about a case, a guy named Tom. And so Tom had a near-death experience in his 40s. And as he was reviewing his life, in just a split second, he experienced and talked in detail, and I will tell you one in a moment, what the others around him were experiencing, not just what he was himself experiencing. So when Tom was in his 20s, driving his pickup truck in his small town, somebody came out of the bar drunk, staggered in front of him. The guy walked over to Tom and smacked him in the face, put his hand in through the window and hit Tom. Tom jumped out and he beat the guy up. And then at the end of that interchange, he looked up at the crowd and said, "He hit me first," and he got into his truck and drove away. Now, in his near-death experience, Tom is inside the bar drinking because his wife has just died. He staggers out in front of this truck. Now he's Tom driving the truck. And then comes around and hits the driver because the driver he thought was trying to ram into him. And then the driver gets out. And at this point, Tom is in both. He's hitting him 32 times. He feels it coming into his face.
Wow.
And then drives the truck away. So that's an example of the life review in near-death experience. So it puts you into the other person's subjectivity when you have acted either very well or very badly. These are the kinds of things, when you act well, you'll feel the other person's joy, gratitude, good feelings. When you act badly, you feel the other person's pain and suffering from your action. Now, who would have thought all of that? I mean,
wow.
When hearing even the science that has been accumulated from collecting these cases, I began to understand more deeply the Buddhist teaching about karma, because basically teaches that you experience directly the effects of your intentional actions on others. And so this comes around to, can anybody do this? Yes, I think they can. It takes effort, though, and it takes desire. Like, if you don't want to learn how to speak this way, if you just want to beat somebody up, you won't put the effort in. But of course, the people that I see, they have either it's family members and they want very much not to be estranged or separated, or it's working situations where people have to go on working together. So, I'm seeing highly motivated people. I believe in my heart of hearts that all humans are motivated to have compassion. So I think that if we could put these different parties into a real dialogue situation, if they were motivated, that anybody could learn that natural compassion and then begin to humanize the other person so that they don't have to get into one of these situations that Tom was in, when he was going through his death experience. So
Right. So to go back full circle, the word that is a prerequisite to the real dialogue is not necessarily respect, but it's the humanization, which is the
yes,
precursor to empathy and to
right.
and from that perspective, I'm sure that this is a principle that would be integrated and applied equally, whether it's a conflict of spouses, neighbors, children, culture, as we can all tap into that humanization because it is such a fundamental, basic part of our existence. Truly, truly wonderful insights. And I learned so much personally, and I'm sure our audience did as well. Thank you, Polly, for joining us today on the Discover You podcast and sharing your remarkable distinctions and observations with us. How can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
My website's the best way, Young-Eisendrath.com, but you can Google my name, Polly Young-Eisendrath. You'll see I have a YouTube channel, have a podcast called Enemies, 2 interview programs. One is called Pay Attention, interviews about truth in troubling times, and the other one is Beyond the Fringe, extraordinary conversations with scientists and sages. So those are my interview programs. Enemies is my podcast. And I've got a bunch of stuff out there because I feel deeply that it is absolutely necessary for us to humanize our species, person by person, with each other. And it's been lovely talking to you, JD, because you have very quick and refined ability to get to the core of the matter.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us as well. We hope you enjoyed today's episode at the Discover You. And at Montare, we want you to know that you're not alone in your journey. To find out more about our treatment programs, you can find us at montarebehavioralhealth.com. And you can listen to our Discover You podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Wishing all of you vibrant health and a safe and fulfilling day. See you next time.